I will hand straight over to Rune, and please, for his presentation on 2011 Oslo Utøya terrorist attacks, are we better prepared in 2021?
Well, thank you. Just give me a thumbs up if the sound's okay.
It's good.
Terrific. Continuously having problems, year and a half in the. As you can see, I'm not in a military camp today. I'm at home, but still, after months and months of pandemics, I'm having problems with the Zoom. So I don't know why. I've tried to address some of the questions that were introduced and comment on, make some reflections on that based on experiences in the 2011 Oslo Utøya operations and the work, the 10 years, it's already 10 years in. So I'll try to say something about the lessons learned in the society or in the normal practice as a whole, and then comment on some specifics based on research we've done after this. So yes, please go to the next. Just to remind those of you that don't remember this particularly, it's 10 years on. In the middle of the summer, there was first a car bomb placed in the government district in Oslo, which is the capital of Norway. It rendered 8 dead, 13 major injuries and 100 minor injuries. As you can see, the government buildings are quite large, so luckily there was not more injuries than this, which is, as we, I guess we'll come back to that, but that's just exactly a medium car bomb with 8 deaths, 30 major injuries and 100 minor injuries. I'm mentioning that because like I said, I'll come back to why that's important. Then if you go to the next slide, the perpetrator, which left the car there, then moved on to an island where a political youth summer camp was held with just about 600 participants. And then 2 hours later, then dressed as a police officer, started a more than 1 hour long shooting spree, which left 69 dead, most of them teenagers, and 55 major injuries, and then just a few small ones. Most of those major injuries were gunshot wounds. So that's just a short version of what happened, and then we'll talk more about what happened afterwards. Next, please. So the question is, are we better prepared now, 10 years on, based on what we experienced? I'm not going into detail on all things identified as lessons, just comment on some of the things that has changed in our practice. So next, please. The Directorate of Health and in corporations with the other directorates here on this one with the police and then the civil authorities have launched several versions of the joint radio communications procedures. I guess it's a technicality. It's small in regards to all the things you have to do, but it was a real problem specifically on the Utøya island, the radio communications, and I think we are better prepared now. It made it clear to us how important it is to be able to communicate across the organization. Then next, please. And there are constantly people coming in that needs to mute, so please do that if you are one of those. Most importantly, I think it was this it's well, I don't know if there's an international term for this. Okay, it's very.
I'm just gonna come in here. Can everybody mute themselves, please? Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah. Still a problem.
Still a problem.
Okay.
Okay, go ahead, Rune.
I'll try to go ahead.
Thank you.
Well, we have a Norwegian term for it with a PLIVO, which is the short of it. It's well, directly into English, it's ongoing life-threatening violence. In the military, we would call it care under fire or something like that. So it's procedures for how to cooperate between the agencies when the threat is still there. Don't have to be fire like gunshot fire, but that's often the case. But it could be a knife or some other kind of weapon. But this is how we do when it's still ongoing violence, because the police have a special focus, of course, of containing this and stopping the violence, and the health services try to evacuate, and it's a trade-off there on how to use the resources, and it's also a training program linked to this. So the next, I'll come a little bit, next. There were quite a lot of discussions when this was developed, not on how to do it, but more on what to expect from the frontline workers. And it contains some, thanks. It contains some legal discussions. I'm not going into those, but there are some principles, some demands or expectations from the society to frontline workers. And then when the discussion was over, it seemed quite banal, but it wasn't at the time, because the safety was very much highlighted. And some people were thinking that you should not go into an area where violence was going on, or there was any kind of threats, really. And that's not how we do it today. And so it's been a journey of those 10 years. So it says that professional emergency personnel must expect to be exposed to a greater risk than is the norm in working life in general. Like I said, it sounds banal, but it wasn't. So if you go into the trade, you need to know that even as an ambulance worker, you're expected to expose yourself to greater risk. But also, greater effort and risk exposure is expected from emergency personnel who are specially trained and have relevant protective equipment than those who do not. And I put the professional emergency personnel there because if you are a volunteer, you are not expected to expose yourself quite as much. And emergency personnel are not expected to enter into a situation if it's obviously involves an unacceptable risk. So it's not no matter what that you have to be a hero and go into the fire. And the efforts must have a reasonable chance of success, which puts a demand on you to make those kind of decisions, to evaluate the chances of success against the risk, and would have to be done at the place, I think. Next. So it also says something that's banal but important, that a very good means to reduce risk exposure is to just do the things quick. And especially for the emergency health services, that means evacuation is the primary task. So we do not stay and play or try to do much treatment on site in this situation. It's evacuation, even before any real triage. Try to evacuate them away from the danger and then do a normal mass casualty operation there. So this is also risk reducing or risk exposure reducing for the patients, to remove them from the environment. And the health operation has sort of an opposite direction of like the police or even the fire fire brigades operations, because they are trying to contain and reduce the risk, but we are trying to remove the patients and ourselves from the risk. So we're sort of running in the opposite direction, and that's an important thing to bear in mind in the standard operating procedures, how we could work together on that. Next, please. We've also developed a national standard for mass casualty triage. I'm sort of particularly proud that all these documents I'm showing you has also in these 10 years been revised. So it's been developed, there's been education, they've been tried out and revised, and some of them have been changed quite a lot, including for some reason the triage system. So I think it's grown more mature over those 10 years. It's not just something that had to be done and then put in a drawer. It's more like living documents. So we have that in place, and it's the same system, civilian, military, and it's a quite simple system that should be available for all kinds of rescue workers, not only health personnel. Next, please. And last, also from the Director of Health, a national guidance on the health services on-scene organization, which I think most of you would not recognize it as a standard operating procedure because it's not that detailed, but it gives direction. And we did not have anything like that really before 2011. So that's something new that's coming to place that I think has a lot of importance also in the education of particularly ambulance workers. Next, please. So that's something you could place down at lessons learned and things that has been done. But it's also, I think, things that makes us more able to meet such situations which are more soft. And I'm trying to make some reflections on that and not talk all day. So let's flip. That's a couple of the questions that you asked in the beginning. How can we ensure that we learn and improve from previous responses? And do we use this knowledge to be more resilient? Next, please. We've done some research based on these 2011 operations regarding commanders' tasks and how incident command were conducted on those days. In Norway, there are few detailed instructions. There were very few detailed instructions before 2011, but even now with all these documents, it's not like a detailed standard operating procedure. So you have to base your command tasks on a more, well, let's say a more fluffy description of how to do it. Next, please. And one of the important things is that commanders may command by direction, by planning, or by influence. And making standard operations, making all those documents and do training on a detailed level, mostly try to address the planning bit of this. But I think we learned from from the rescue operations that day that also leading by direction and leading by influence is important. That perhaps need a little different skill set, which is not that easy to describe in a document. Next, please. So we learned that operative professionals in general have the expertise and specialization to make decision-making primarily intuitive. That is in their daily work. And that requires a sufficient degree of experience. And the problem with mass casualty incidents and terrorist incidents particularly, is that most of us do not have experience with that. So novices are often more dependent on following rules and ask for algorithms and more detailed standard operating procedure to do this structured and fail-safe. Next, please. Yeah. And decision makers often have a distorted view on the epidemiology of large-scale accidents. And that day, when you saw the picture of the large government buildings, and of course we were expecting loads and loads of patients, and we're trying to set up a rescue operations based on that. And then we ended up with just a little more than 100 patients, only 13 of them major, and 8 deaths, and that's quite small numbers. But if we have known then what I know now about car bombs, I would expected those numbers, because that's a typical car bomb in a situation like that. And that would have made decision making much easier for us that day if we had more knowledge about the epidemiology of large-scale accidents. So commanders would benefit from general knowledge of characteristics of different types of mass casualty incidents. So if you have the mental capacity, because you have that basic knowledge, it's easier to grasp the situation and start on the right foot, so to speak. So I guess that's not the most important thing you learn in basic training, but somewhere along the way that would be useful for you. Next, please. So our studies on commanders at the Oslo bombing scene show that concrete experience from previous major accidents eased situation assessment a lot, and then they took in the sensory cues like smell and sound, and immediately understood what that meant. A colleague of mine was out in a boat. He was coming on duty half an hour into the accident, and he heard the sound from this, and because he had been in Afghanistan, he immediately recognized it as a car bomb, which most of the others at the scene used an hour or so before we were sure that's what happened. So experience is good. But we also learned that training, some formal education, and also just a professional interest, that you were reading those journals, that you listening to those case stories, and had a general interest in mass casualty incidents and how to address those, made it much easier to make sense of this and to carry a commander role in at the scene, even if you had no experience from before. So next, please. And that means, are we better prepared? Well, we have made all these joint and health specific operating procedures, which has been, like I said, developed, trained, and then revised. But also the level of knowledge and experience in the Norwegian emergency organizations have been raised, and not just the experience, but also the attention this has drawn over those 10 years. So very few of us have a personal experience from these operations, but the organizations which were involved have some organizational experience. So you know that someone in your organization know and have the personal experience. It's also been carried out a few scientific studies, which I think it's important that you do when something like that happen. But we should not underestimate the storytelling, that when you're at work and nothing happens and you have coffee in your hand, you can listen to some of the others with which can share their personal or even just organizational experience. And you can learn from that, because when you listen into how they experienced that day and acted that day, you would know more about how to react if you get into something like that. So it's softer learning, but I think we should not underestimate that. I think that's the last one.
Thank you, Rune. That's a very important message there, especially about how knowledge of past events improves mental ability to recognize, understand, and respond to security critical events. We're going to move straight on to Steve and his presentations on lessons learned from the London bombings. Go ahead, Steve.
Okay, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Next slide, please, Anna. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is related around the London bombings in 2005. 52 people killed, over 700 injured. There were 4 bomb attacks, 3 on London Underground trains and 1 on a bus. The explosions on the trains took place within 1 minute, and the explosion on the bus was about an hour later. So in the UK, we've been working for some time, a bit like the 2 previous speakers have talked about a joint doctrine for an interoperability framework. Next slide. What this is a guidance for police, fire and ambulance to develop an interoperability in the early stage of the response to a major or a complex incident. And the purpose is to provide the commanders of those emergency services with a framework to enable them to respond together as effectively as possible. Jessup is available as an app which you can download off the internet onto your phone. You won't get a lot of the detail, but you certainly will get enough to help you. So next slide, please. There are 5 key principles to this framework, all to do with co-location, joint communication, coordination of activity, a joint understanding of the risks involved, and a shared situational awareness, because different staff will have different understanding of what they're dealing with, particularly if you've got a multi-site event. And if you look at that diagram there, it's about gathering information intelligence, assessing the risks and developing a working strategy, what powers, policies and procedures are available, what are the options and contingencies, and then take actions and review what happened. And that's all about working together to save lives and reducing harm. Next slide, please. So as part of this, CBRNE Limited has been working on an EU project called Proactive, which is in line with the EU action plan about enhancing preparedness against CBRNE incidents. And what you'll find in most capital cities now, they're very cosmopolitan. They have lots of non-native speakers, people with special needs, other communications challenges. Many victims will be from other countries. There will be different cultures and customs with regard to treatment of people who are deceased. There's also an international element to these nowadays, which is very important for the reputation of the home country where the attacks took place. And the media is very intrusive. And domestically, you probably have some control, but certainly internationally, or with more and more use of social media, it's much more challenging to manage those. And if I look at my own experience, I was involved in the Lockerbie plane crash back in the 80s, and this was involving Pan Am. Pan Am wanted to control the whole scene, telling relatives about their condition of their loved ones and things like that. And that's not acceptable in the UK. So we had a big standoff with a private company about this, but things have moved on since then. Next slide, please. So part of the Proactive, there are 15 partners in the consortium with a much wider network, different types of research methods. There are a number of deliverables that label with a project, It's working across 12 countries. So a lot of you are from the EU, can get involved in proactive. There's lots of synergies with others, hence me taking part of this seminar today for no fear. There will be 3 joint field exercises in Germany, Italy and Belgium, where something like 15% of the volunteers who will participate will come from vulnerable groups. And emerging out of this will be a number of toolkits to help emergency services across the EU to manage these type of incidents better. Okay, so next slide, please. So learning from the London experience and others that have taken place since, confusion in these type of incidences is perfectly normal. You will not have a full picture of what it is you're dealing with for hours. So what you need is well-trained and equipped responders. If you've got a multi-site attack, dealing with situational awareness, establishing that is much more difficult. And a key point is that you need commanders who are able to deal with ambiguity and confusion. If they can deal with those things and still make decisions in the absence of a complete picture, they are key success factors in how you deal with these types of incidents. And I speak from personal experience in these type of things as well. Next slide, please. Okay, so health and safety has been mentioned by the other speakers, is again a very big issue. In the very early stages of the London bombings, because these trains run on electricity, a lot of the first responders were very reluctant to go into the tunnels for fear of being electrocuted. And it was quite a barrier to get operations running. And actually what happened was an inspector, police inspector from British Transport Police actually jumped onto the live rail to demonstrate that it was safe for them to go down the tunnel and start treating survivors. If you are dealing underground, there will be a lot of vermin around, rats, mice, other unpleasant creatures. So you need to protect your staff when they're going into these types of environment. Particularly if it's an old system like the London Underground, there'll be a lot of asbestos around. So staff will need breathing apparatus to protect themselves from this type of work. The London Underground relies on the piston effect of trains moving around to keep the air circulating. If you're stuck in the underground and the trains don't move for something like 45 minutes, you will start to get casualties through lack of oxygen, because the build-up of carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide and other gases. So these are things that you also need to think about when your staff are working underground. And of course, breathing apparatus, if they're using that, gives them a limited time on site. And they also had to get to the scene and get away in a safe time as well. These attacks took place in July, so the system was very hot, so they need a lot of hydration. So working underground extended periods is very, very challenging for your staff. So you need to ensure that you rotate them around very quickly. Because of the amount of body material, cuts from dealing with sharp objects, infections is a very high risk as well that you need to think about. And then the last one I put on this slide is about welfare issues for your staff dealing with these. Many years ago, around the Lockerbie time, Heathrow had a body recovery team which comprised of officers across the whole spectrum of service who would be deployed where there were mass casualties. Lockerbie was one. The Marchioness disaster on the Thames, Biggin Hill involved in a helicopter. And a number of these young officers that were involved in these never ever recovered from the trauma that they suffered dealing with this. At Lockerbie, at the end of the investigation, there were 600 bags of human remains that couldn't be identified. Be less of a problem nowadays because of DNA, but we didn't have anything like that. So all these welfare issues around young first responders dealing with the carnage that you come across these types of things is a big issue for you to think about. Next slide, please. So here's some more planning. Mass casualties, what are you going to do with all the bodies? They need to be stored in an environment that the pathology can take place. You need to know and train with other agencies. Over my police career, I dealt with police, fire and ambulance on a regular basis. We all knew each other at quite senior level by first names, so we knew what to expect and what they would expect from us. So it's a very good idea to do that sort of thing. We rely a lot on mobile phone technology, but so do the public, and these systems can crash. So if you can't use it, how else are you going to get in touch with your staff? There'll be huge demands for information from internally, from your own organisation, from your government, and from the media as well. So you've got to think about that. Talking about the media, it's not a police responsibility, but you need to manage this. And you need access to decision makers for different areas of your business. You need to invest in your community, because as I talked earlier on about cultural difficulties with dealing with dead people. If you've got those community contacts, they are invaluable. And you can also provide reassurance for them. Are your IT systems fit for purpose? If you're downloading vast amounts of data, will they still work all right? How are you going to inform family members of the death or injury of their families, where they are being taken to, how you're going to get them there? If you need to purchase equipment or you need to hire things in, have you got funding mechanisms? And after the event, you need to review your command systems. Did they work well? And any learning that you've got to improve your future performance. Next slide, please. Okay, this is something which I sort of embraced myself. You can't plan for everything, because I guarantee you that if you think you've got a contingency plan for everything, the next incident will not be catered for by that. But what you can do is you can plan for anything. Next slide, please. If you have more open contingency plans, so think about what scenarios you might deal with, think about what ifs, think about building in flexibility into your training. I noticed one of the slides earlier was about novices tend to want to stick to tried and tested procedures, but if they don't work, they need that flexibility to plan for different things. You need to exercise and practice these with different agencies. You need to make sure you've got very good business continuity plans and that they're regularly updated to take account of changes. And my last slide coming up now, please, is to do with crisis management. And the critical success factor is any effective response to a major incident or large-scale emergency has to be multi-agency. But what it needs is clear leadership. And that leadership is developed through training and experience. It's not a science, but it is an art, and people get better with practice. And if you look at things like the Manchester Arena, which is a much more recent event in the UK, there was quite a lot of confusion because there was no clear leadership, because there were a number of agencies who thought they were or were not in charge, and it made it much more challenging for the people to deal with it. So if you get the opportunity, immerse yourself in training. It gives you great experience, and as the military say, train and exercise hard. You do the real thing is much easier to manage. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Steve. It was really interesting to hear your presentation, and not least to hear about the JESIP model. The emergency services must ensure that they are constantly update work practices and learn from previous incidents together and not just in isolation. So thank you so much to all of the presenters. I will open the floor for questions. We still have a few minutes left, so please don't be shy to ask your questions or share your reflections. And Fred, if you can help me read out the questions, if anybody writes in the chat box, that would be really good. Thank you.
Maybe I can ask a question while we let others think a little bit.
That'd be really good. Thank you.
It usually takes a little bit of time to get the questions in. I was just wondering, a lot of you, first of all, thank you to all three fantastic presentations, really on point, and some or several common themes, maybe not so surprising. One thing that comes up a lot is the sort of aspect of interoperability. And I'm wondering, related to the different levels of risk exposure between and within different agencies, whether the kind of ethical implications of emergency responders being on site with different let's say levels of risk exposure allowed. I guess that affects the kind of operationalization of those levels. Like if you have a few, 2 or 3 guys from the SWAT team that are there, but without the team leader, for example, and you have a fully equipped like 3 ambulance teams, and you have some people from the fire brigade, who takes lead? Is it always those with a high risk exposure on site, or is it then whatever most complete team or unit that takes charge, and then takes charge of teams that have a higher risk exposure than one's own sort of direct team? It's a bit of a ethical dilemma, and I'm guessing it's also difficult for the colleagues with lower risk exposure levels to stand aside and let, if there's just a few people that have that kind of mandate to go in, to let them go in and wait. So just wondering if you guys have some reflections on that long question of mine.
Perhaps I'll start off, if you like, on that. If you look at the 3 emergency services, the least equipped with personnel, equipment and breathing apparatus is actually the police in the UK. The fire brigade, fire and rescue service, have breathing apparatus because they need it to go into burning buildings and things like that. So there's almost like an unwritten rule in the UK that if it's a hazardous scene like that, it will be the organisation that's best equipped in terms of personnel equipment to go into these types of events. So for the UK, it would be the fire brigade. Now the ambulance service, the medical workers, they've also been equipped with breathing apparatus as well, so they can go down and give first aid and things like that. And frankly, the police tend to be more about managing the scene, controlling cordons, and just facilitating the operations of the fire brigade and the medical workers.
So in the Norwegian system, it would always be the police that takes the overall charge, and they have, well, the police is quite hierarchical, and they should know who of them internally are in charge, and if that's not unambiguous for the people there, they would ask the guys in the dispatch center. But the system in the health services is perhaps somewhat surprising to some of you, because the direction just says that the people who are there have to decide who's in charge. And that's based on experience from lots of larger scale incidents in Norway, that the systems that have been in place to decide who should be in charge, where and what, has not some of that had even been written down in law. But when it comes down to the actual emergency services operations, they actually decide there and then who wants to be in charge and has the skills, and then based on a situation assessment there and then decide who should be in charge. And in quite a few instances, the leadership is transferred when more suitable personnel are coming to the scene. So of course, many services have quite rigid systems, and in day-to-day services this is not a problem. It's predefined, but you could always have a situation like the one you in your question tried to draw up a situation where we have some from here, some from here. It's not that clear. So what we have learned is that people just get together and decide who wants to do this, who are able, and then that's the leader. So that's the official system, really.
Mm-hmm. And in France, as you know, we are used to work with firefighters and police in the pre-hospital field. So it's quite, it's well organized, and firefighters are very well equipped. So they are in charge of safety, and in case of security issues, police, gendarmerie, and we can ask special forces to help. So all agencies are interconnected, and we can talk together and have clear orders. So it's quite clear, and the leadership is not really a problem.
Thank you. It's interesting to hear three quite different perspectives on that, actually. I don't see any other hands so far, Anna.
No, I can't see them either. Are there any questions now in the end, in the last minutes? And if not, I'm just saying that in the end of the day, frontline workers work to keep our country safe. In our ever-changing world, however, they must adapt to the demands placed on them. This means cooperation and collaboration in dealing with big crises. And on that note, if did it come in a question?
It's a comment.
It's a comment, yeah, from Paul. Your lecture containing a lot of interesting and useful information. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, that it must be a multi-agency response, which is exactly what we all are thinking. I feel. On that note, if there's no more questions, I would thank you all for your attention today, and please feel free to reach out to me or visit us, the Utøya project, on our webpage or any of our social media channels. Thank you.